Welcome, everybody. Really appreciate you all coming out to Neighbor Day and joining us here at Runway 4 Event Center. Thank you very much. We are so thrilled to bring this presentation to you on this wonderful aircraft that sits behind us, the PBY. Today we have John Boyd and Susan Peterson joining us. They are going to have a discussion about the history of this aircraft and the adventures that ensued to bring all of it to life here at Runway 4 Event Center. Just really quickly, Runway 4 Event Center is available to anyone who wants to lease the space for corporate events, weddings, ceremony of life events. So if you're interested, please contact one of us and we can make those arrangements. This aircraft behind us is being restored by Vintage Aircraft Restorations, LLC. And if you have any questions about the restoration process or volunteering to help restore the aircraft, please come see me, see John, or there's a sign-up sheet right over here next to the t-shirt sales. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to John and Susan.
Hi, I'm John Boyle. I'm one of the volunteers here, and I'm a retired Air Force public affairs officer. I spent 20 years in the military, and I came from a military background, so I kind of fit easily into that. And as a public affairs officer, I made it my business to learn all about airplanes. And that was kind of easy because coming from a military family, my dad flew B-17s in World War II. And he spent 27 years in the Air Force as a pilot. So I grew up in that area and again, spent my own career doing that. And then after I retired, I was a television news person in Texas for a few years, and then I came back up to Spokane. I'm a Whitworth graduate, so I have some history here in Spokane. And I was one of the main docents and volunteers at the Historic Flight Foundation, and now we're talking about the PBY. And with me today is Susan Peterson. She has quite the history with this particular airframe.
Thank you, John. So I'm Susan Peterson. In 2010, I met Rick Peterson, and we were together for 10 years. He passed in 2020. When we met, he wanted to talk about the PBY because anybody that was going to spend much time with him was also going to be involved in the PBY. At that time, he had owned the PBY since 1999. We lived in Sammamish. He drove his flatbed trailer truck combo out to Moses Lake, where the PBY has been until it came to Spokane. 2 or 3 times a year, he spent 2 or 3 weeks out working on it. When he bought the airplane, it was a fire bomber configuration. It had none of the military accoutrements on it, so he put the waist twisters on, which you see behind me. There's a replica of a 50 cal machine gun, for example. In the front, the nose has been restored. Part of that's off now because of space constraints. This is a real big airplane. Wingspan 104, length 65, tail, tall tail, can't fit in here. We'll have to see what John does with that.
Well, Susan is kind of in a unique position. Her partner, Rick, as she said, bought this airplane in 1999. He was looking for a PBY to restore. Now, Central Washington used to be the PBY headquarters for the world because they were used as fire bombers up there throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And as she was saying, he looked around at the various PBYs that were available, and he chose to buy this one because it was unmodified and very stock.
What he wasn't was he wasn't a pilot. He wasn't an A&P. He had a long career as a mariner. He was the chief engineer for the largest Alaska fishing fleet. He designed and developed the processing refrigeration for the 400-foot trawlers, and that was in the 70s and the 80s. One thing that he did up in the Aleutians was he flew in and out of Dutch Harbor. In World War II, Dutch Harbor happened to be a PBY base, and in fact, the Japanese attacked those PBYs. There were enough left over that during the 70s and 80s, they were used as transports out of Alaska. So there was something that stuck in his mind about that PBY, and of course, being a mariner, seeing a seaplane was even better. So, even though he wasn't a pilot, he wasn't an A&P. He'd worked with large marine engines. He was a fabulous mechanic, and so he wasn't fazed to go ahead and buy this airplane. He was also a Vietnam vet. He was there from 65 to 66. He was wounded. He has a Purple Heart, Bronze Star, and other combat types of awards.
So what we had was a marine engineer who fell in love with this airplane and was working on it. Susan met and fell in love with Rick, and she was dragged into PBY ownership that way. Now, a lot of your wives can probably relate to that, whether you're into antique cars, horses, airplanes. That's how Susan got to be a PBY expert herself. So I met Rick in 2011. Fairchild had closed its runway for resurfacing, and they put some of the KC-135 alert airplanes out at Moses Lake, which was a military airfield up until the 1960s. My nephew was an official with the Air National Guard. He said, "Come on out and I'll give you a tour." So we got out on the ramp. I'm looking around at old airplanes. Here's this PBY there. I walk over to it, and Rick introduces himself to me and tells me his story. And he was out there on the ramp on a tall ladder fixing something up on the engine pylon, the wing pylon, and he told me his story. And he was a one-man operation, again, not a pilot, just an expert mechanic, an expert engineer restoring this airplane.
One of the things that he discovered early on was that the key to getting the equipment replaced in this airplane depended on the World War II vets. So instead of going down the path of getting the airplane airworthy, he decided to go for the equipment because the vets were becoming older, their networks were breaking down, and the equipment just wasn't available. If you go into this airplane, you have walkways or catwalks that go all the way through, and you need to watch where you're going because if you take a misstep, you fall down into the hull. Every compartment is closed with a bulkhead door, and so you really get the feel of being inside a boat, almost a submarine in a way because of the lack of windows. When he bought the airplane, it had been a fire tanker, so there was nothing on the inside. There weren't any catwalks. I've talked to his son about that, and he says basically you're crawling through that airplane trying to figure out where you are. So the compartments, starting at the front, you've got, in the bow, you've got a bombardier's apartment in front of the cockpit. Behind the cockpit, you have what is called the office, navigator, radio man, and radar. This PBY-6A being one of the first airplanes in the PBY line to have a full complement of radar. And it's quite possible that Rick was the only person to ever completely gather all the components of the radar. So that's going to be really special, having that back in the plane. Behind the office is the engineer's station, and you see the pylon up there. And imagine the wing, and the guy has to climb a little ladder, and he's essentially suspended, has his own separate panel, looks at the fuel, also watches the engines, and hopefully doesn't lose his hearing. Behind that there's a galley, there's a stove. I do believe this is the only original electric stove. You see some propane stoves in some of the other PBYs, but if you go to the 600-page equipment manual, you'll see that the spec is an electric stove. So there's a lot of hidden little gems in this airplane, and when it gets put back together, it's going to be something. I know a lot of people have taken a peek into the back, but you ain't seen nothing yet.
The one thing that Rick told me that was very important is that this is the most comprehensively equipped PBY left in the world. It has equipment and radios and interior furnishings that the Navy doesn't have on their PBY at their museum in Pensacola, Florida. So this, when it is restored, will be an absolute world-class aircraft. As Susan said, when these things were converted into fire bombers, they put scoops and tanks inside, they modified the nose, they took out the nose gun position, they made them into tremendously different airplanes. They replaced the blisters. So this is a far cry from the PBYs that you would see as a fire bomber like you see in the movie Always, or the airplane that was based for many years up at Deer Park. This will be an absolute flying museum when it's done. And as you can see here, Rick and now John has all the radios, the radar equipment. This thing will be absolutely as it was in the war. And what makes this airframe particularly interesting, aside from the originality of it, is that this is the very last PBY produced. It's a PBY 6A. It was the last airplane to leave the assembly line at New Orleans, Louisiana. So, fascinating airplane, a lot of history with this particular ship, and its originality and configuration and equipment make it extra special. So when it's flying in 2, 3, 4 years, I think it'll be something special. Right now, parts of it are out being painted. The engines are in the shop for a rebuild. The props are being inspected, and it will hopefully all come together and fly.
So the rest of the compartments, we've gotten through the galley. The next one is the sleeping area, and there's 4 bunks. And those areas were really important as this plane was used as a search and rescue, particularly in the Pacific theater. And what would happen is there'd be downed pilots, and these PBYs would land in the high seas, and they would open the waste blister there and drop a life raft and get those guys up here and then bring them in. And that was quite an operation, particularly if those people were wounded. So they had warm bunks, they had coffee. There is such a thing as a PBY toilet, and I really liked having that around. I figured if there was ever a disaster, I would be best set disaster toilet around. It's a really cool thing. It's got a bakery seat. It has a bucket that comes out, and it's actually quite civilized. And when Rick got that, and there's a YouTube video that he did, which people should look up, PBY for Sale, Frederick Peterson. It's a wonderful YouTube video. And the thing that other people have cut out to put in their vintage airplane videos is generally what he says about the toilet, because he's so enthusiastic about some of these things. It's just really neat. So then the final component here is the waste blister. These are 50 caliber, obviously replica machine guns. Just to finish it off, where people were taking a look in, that's called the tail hatch. And the tunnel gun goes in there, that's a 30 cal. The tunnel gunner would lie on his stomach and stick his head out that tail hatch and fire away. And then to complete the guns on the bow turret, there are two 30 cals. So that's the armament. We have options for torpedoes and bombs on the big wings. It's a little hard to imagine here, but these planes went out and did a job, particularly in Europe. The search and rescue in the Pacific was really something. There's some pictures, for example, where there were so many downed sailors that they were brought up and they were tied to the top of the wings, and far beyond any kind of standard what pilots should be able to do. In fact, one guy got in a lot of trouble with the Navy for trying to take off with all of those people tied onto the plane. But there were sharks, so what else are you going to do?
So when John bought this from Susan after Rick's death, he found something rather strange. He had to go to Susan's house to pick up parts. And John said that there were parts in the basement, in the greenhouse, in the living room. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, when Rick passed, there were maybe 20% of the parts and equipment in the shed and the garage, and that was reasonable, I thought. Most of the other stuff he had mounted and organized in the airplane. But as time went on, it became apparent that I really needed to have everything in one place. I needed to do an inventory. I needed to be able to have someone come to my house, and basically we called it the Peterson PBY store. And so his son and I and another friend took a long, long weekend, and we emptied the airplane and brought stuff back. And then the things like the stove, the toilet, the engineer's panel, the radar. I thought those were just fine decorations for the den downstairs. The rest of the stuff filled up the garage, the shed.
And if you're wondering what's behind these black curtains, that's all the PBY parts and the electronics. So putting this thing back together is not only going to be a work of the airframe, but also fitting the equipment inside. So it'll be quite the job. What were Rick's plans for the airplane long term?
You know, he was more interested in having it go to a museum because he realized that the completeness of the airplane would lend itself to people taking a look at it. And once you start flying with an airplane that has vintage stuff, I mean, obviously the cockpit has to change, the communications gear has to change. So he really didn't envision it necessarily flying. When I came along, I really wanted it to fly. I had a lot of people that wanted to buy the parts from me or some of the equipment. And as many good guys as there are in aviation, they are no good guys. And I really had to rely on his warbird circle of friends, and that helped me tremendously. There were some people that just, I could literally call anytime and say, does this make sense to you? Is this right? And that's how I learned. I mean, I studied the parts books, but I also needed some of the street smarts that some of these pilots and restoration people had. And I just waited. I wanted someone that wanted the airplane, that was going to take all the equipment, that was going to turn this into essentially a flying museum. So I'm thrilled.
And right now, they made thousands of PBYs in the war. I have an exact figure here. But today, only about 15 fly. They were used for years, as we said, as fire bombers. That's a very hard life for an aircraft, very dangerous life for an aircraft. So while PBYs, airworthy PBYs, were somewhat common 20, 30 years ago, that's no longer the case. And with this airframe, as we said, being the last one built, and with its completeness and the accessories with it, I think it's important that it does fly. There are very few flying today in military markings, and that's part of the plan. John will have this restored in its factory, correct 1945 Navy markings, which is 2 tones of blue and white, similar to the Grumman Goose that's out there on the ramp, owned by Spokane's own Addison Pemberton. So when this is flying, we'll have a couple of really nice world-class Navy airplanes here.
2 years sounds like a long time, but it goes fast, and there's so much work to be done, and it's going to be done in such an authentic way. I think this plane is just, as the last one made, it's really an interesting dimension to the airplane. I mean, 3,300 PBYs were made between 1936 and 1945, and this is documented as the last one. There's an interesting picture of this airplane coming off the line in the original paint with 18 of the Consolidated Airplane engineers in front of the airplane, and those 18 people had also worked on the first PBY, so that's really a neat deal. On the front of the airplane, you can see it. You really have to look for it. There's something called a data plate, and it's got number 64107, which is the serial number showing that that's the last PBY. So we have a complete provenance on the airplane as well. It's pretty exciting. Consolidated made most of the PBYs in San Diego, and when the 6A came along, they opened a new factory in New Orleans. And that was really interesting. They had a harder time getting aviation people, but they did manage to get the factory lined up. Now, it opened in 1945. In early September 1945, the Japanese surrendered. This airplane came off the line on September 27th. So things started to shut down. New Orleans had a big, exciting thing. They thought the PBYs were going to go on forever and they were going to be the new center of the PBY world. But within 5 days, Consolidated shut the plant. And this airplane just made it off the line.
How many were built in New Orleans?
About 700, I think.
700 of them?
Yeah,
The 6As, all the 6As, all the 6As.
Consolidated made 2,400 PBYs total.
I think that was 2,400 in the U.S. and then Canada. There's a number of them that were made in Kansas. They call them from Canada.
The PBY was so important to the war effort, the Navy had its own airplane factory, the Naval Aircraft Factory in Philadelphia. Today they're most famous for building their little N2N trainer, which was the Navy equivalent of a Stearman. Addison Pemberton has one here on the field, as a matter of fact, another rare airplane. But they made an improved version of the PBY called the Nomad, and they made 155 at the Navy Aircraft Factory in Philadelphia. The airplane was in such demand that early in the war, the Navy asked for some to be built, and Boeing actually got the contract, and they made 362 of them in Vancouver under license by Boeing Canada.
But Nomads or
Catalinas. So they would have been 5 Catalinas. So they were built by Boeing in Canada in Vancouver. Later in the war, the Canadians shifted their production to what became the Canadian Aircraft Factory, Canadair, and they built 369 in Montreal by the Canadian Vickers Company. So we had them built in San Diego, New Orleans, Vancouver, Montreal, and Philadelphia.
And the Soviet Union built about 25 to 30 of them.
So the Soviet Union was a big customer for PBYs. The largest customer, aside from the U.S. Navy, was the British Royal Air Force, they had 700 of them and about 20 different squadrons. Between them and the U.S. Navy, they were seen all over the world. And what most people don't remember is the U.S. Army Air Force had a squadron of these in England to rescue downed bomber pilots from the North Sea. And some of the last American Air Force casualties in Europe were in an Army Air Force OA-10 at Catalina, that's what they called it. And one of their airplanes was shot down at the very end of the war. And if you go to the American Air Museum in Duxford, England, as you walk into it, they have a display, a glass wall showing all the airplanes that were lost. And amongst them are 3 Catalinas that were air-sea rescue airplanes. So the U.S. Navy continued to operate the Catalina up until 1957. The Air Force operated them up until about 1953, when they were replaced by the Grumman Albatross. Foreign countries used them forever. I believe 17 different countries used the PBY for their navies. And that was everybody from Denmark, Japan, Italy, most of the NATO countries, France, as well as the Commonwealth.
I was on USS Courage, seaplane tender.
Mm-hmm.
1960, we had PBYs.
Really?
Mariner models.
Well, the PBY was, the last of the great Navy amphibians. After the PBY, the Navy had a couple of other seaplanes. The pretty much forgotten Martin Marlin, but the PBY is the classic amphibian. After the war, it was used as an airliner in the South Pacific. Qantas, the Australian Airlines used them, the French airline used them. So they were used as civilian airplanes really up until probably the 1990s.
Right, that brings to mind that this airplane in the 50s was lent from the U.S. Navy to the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute in Massachusetts, and was supporting early marine research. And it really did have some interesting destinations everywhere from Chile to Iceland. So even though this did not see combat action, it's interesting how the PBYs really persisted through the 50s and the 60s. People tend to think of them mainly as the fire bombers, firefighting machines, but they were used in other things, and it's kind of nice to think about this plane going out and doing early marine research.
And if you're of a certain age and were watching TV in the 70s, you remember the Jacques Cousteau Oceanographer series. Well, he had especially equipped PBY.
And it was a 6A.
So,
Yeah.
so PBYs were pretty ubiquitous, not only as military aircraft, but as airliners, fire bombers, and as research aircraft. So hopefully John will continue that with his PBY, and it will continue to operate out of Phelpsfield. And Phelpsfield is, between the efforts of John Sessions and Addison Pemberton, kind of a hub for antique aircraft, and especially waterborne aircraft.
I think the last thing I would say about Rick Peterson is he was a real bulldog. He was persistent, and he literally went around the world to find and procure different pieces of equipment. But he wouldn't have done it or been so successful, I guess, at doing it if he hadn't been a veteran, if he hadn't developed bonds with these World War II vets. Of course, he was out of Vietnam. He was Purple Heart. He could talk about the real world of combat, and that went a far way. But he also did some interesting things. Being a mariner and being Coast Guard trained, he was quite a professional diver. And this was a story I only found out about this past week. I knew I was coming, and I was talking to a bunch of his work buddies, just trying to see if there was something new that I didn't know. And there was a shipwrecked PBY up on the west coast of Vancouver Island, and he went up there. You know, he was good for 100-foot plus dives, and he did that, but he came back up and he said, I shouldn't have done that dive. It was too dark, it was too deep, too much current, but he came up with a couple of parts. And so they motor back to the dock, and the Canadian Mounties are waiting for him. Hey, this stuff belongs to the Royals. This isn't for Americans to take out of the country. And Rick went into charm mode and also talked about what he had just endured. And the Mountie said, okay, you can have the stuff, just get out of here.
So every great project needs somebody's dream to make it happen. In this case, it was Rick Peterson, carried on by his wife, Susan, and now John and Susan will hopefully bring this to fruition for all of us to enjoy. And as we saw with the Historic Flight Foundation, Spokane likes old airplanes. I think we're in a good position to build on the history of Phelps Field, which has a very rich history going back to the mid-1920s. And we hope that everybody will continue to come out here and check on the progress of the PBY and join John when it is finally airworthy again. So it's going to be coming together, and thanks to Rick Peterson and Susan, we have an airplane that can be restored and be a living monument to the people that built it 80 years ago. So that's it. I think if you have any questions, I'll stick around. If you want to talk about the PBY, I can come up with some answers. The type's very historic, and we hope that this airplane, being the last one built, will continue that. So, thank you.